Well, that's where the government stands on this. Let's bring in some opposition voices to the conversation. We've got James Bezan joining us. He is the national defence critic for the Conservative Party of Canada, who we are going to start with. Don Davies, though, also joining us, the health critic for the New Democrats. James, you heard what the minister was saying there. I want to get your response and reaction to what Harjit Sajjan has been saying.
Well, I think what we're hearing here is that the Liberals are desperate. They don't have a plan, and so they're essentially are calling in the military to clean up their mess. And yes, we can have confidence in the skills and ability of the Canadian Armed Forces, but I know that we had General Fortin and General Cadeau and the Surgeon General at committee just last week. We had the Deputy Surgeon General at the Defense Committee today, and they are still in the very early stages of trying to figure out the logistics of distributing the vaccine. So yes, Operation Laser has been set up since the beginning of this pandemic, and the military has been very much front and center in providing care into our long-term care homes when there was a major gap in the ability to care for our loved ones. But we still don't know when the vaccines are coming. You mentioned Operation Warp Speed in the United States. They've been going since May the 15th. The United Kingdom are booking appointments today for people to be vaccinated for COVID-19 next week. And we have still no idea when the vaccine is coming, how it's going to be distributed, whether the infrastructure exists to actually handle some of these vaccines. I know that the Canadian Armed Forces, as it stands today, do not have the freezer capabilities to handle the Pfizer product that needs to be at -70 centigrade. So Patty Hajdu and Justin Trudeau are desperate, and so they've called in the military to, pretty much clean up their mess. But we're still going to be waiting sometime till March, April, before we know when our loved ones in care homes are the most vulnerable are going to be taken care of, which includes my father. What about our frontline healthcare workers? My wife, who is a nurse in long-term care, along with all her other colleagues across this country, need to be vaccinated. When is that going to happen? And how many more people have to get ill and die because of Liberal dithering and delays?
Yeah, Don, I want to get your take, too, because the minister said to me, when I asked why is it taken so long to actually appoint a person to lead this effort, he said, the armed forces have been embedded from day one. This is part of an evolution. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's good news and bad news here. I'll start with the bad news. I think we're seeing a government that is in panic mode and confusion. I guess the good news is I think that the good work that opposition parties have done in the last week or two has really accelerated them and spurred them to action. Look, my colleague Matthew Green, who's our procurement critic, had the minister at his committee last week and asked directly if the armed forces were involved in vaccine distribution, and the answer was no. So this strikes me as something that's just been thrown together. Now, to put this in perspective, to show you where Canada is in terms of our lack of preparation compared to the rest of the world, Australia has published a 12-page detailed document laying out their full vaccine distribution plan. And they're similar to Canada, a mid-sized parliamentary democracy, federal government. The U.S. plans on inoculating next month in December 20 million people and then 30 million every month thereafter. So by the end of March, they will have inoculated 110 million people. That's a third of their population. We may have done 6 million doses. We may have 3 million people done, which is 8% of our population by then. And finally, there still has been no acceptable answer from this government as to why we seem to be the only country that has failed to negotiate the right to produce vaccines in Canada, which seems to be key to making sure that a country can get the vaccines to their population quickly, as the Prime Minister was forced to admit last week. So, I think this government has been caught sleeping, and we've had to force them into action. And good news, I guess, is that they are starting to move.
James, you're in Manitoba, back into lockdown, of course, and the situation is getting worse in British Columbia, where Don is as well, in Ontario, where I am. We're all going through this and watching the case counts. The Prime Minister saying, if all goes well, Canadians will be inoculated by September of 2021. So in other words, 10 months from now. Your reaction to that?
It's just another sad narrative coming from the Prime Minister, in front of the cottage. Here he is again, because of his inability to put Canadians first, to make sure that we have access to these vaccines early on in the production cycle, really is putting more Canadians at risk. And that is unforgivable. And you combine that with, as Don mentioned already, he said back in May that we're going to have the ability to produce the vaccines right here in Canada. And now he's backing away from that, saying we can't. And he's trying to blame everybody else but himself. But we know that the National Research Council has the facility. They have the capability. I know that they were going through some renovations. But aside from that fact, that should have been a priority to make sure that we could produce enough vaccines to, at the very least, at the beginning of this rollout of vaccinations across the country, that we could do it early in collaboration and injunction at the same time the Americans, the UK, the European Union, and others are vaccinating their citizens. But let's make sure that we have the prioritized list of those that are most in need of getting the vaccine first. And we don't even have that from the government. We asked for the production of that list today at the National Defence Committee, because we are studying COVID-19 and the Canadian Armed Forces. And, all the members were asking, where is the plan? And there's nothing there yet, because the Canadian Armed Forces have just been tasked with this. And it's all about, the inability of the Liberal government to actually get the job done.
Don, James raises an interesting point about, all the other countries that are, quote unquote, ahead of us in line, because they do have domestic capabilities that we simply don't have. The Americans, the British, the Germans, the French, the Spanish, the Mexicans, India, Indonesia, and probably a couple of other countries that are on that list as well. As the health critic for the NDP, how confident are you of the rollout plan? We see what's happening in Ontario with retired General Rick Hillier. We've now got Major General Danny Fortin leading the federal effort as well, that, when we get those vaccines, let's say it's February or March, that we're going to be able to do this well. Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, saying this has the recipe to be a logistical nightmare.
Well, hope springs eternal. And, look, nobody in Parliament on any side of the aisles wants us to fail. We all want to make sure Canadians get timely access to effective vaccine as soon as possible. That's why we've been so dogged in demanding details. And I'll tell you, I can't understand any federal government being so reluctant and resistant to releasing any kind of information. And now what they're doing is, James has pointed out well, they're just making it up as they're going along. I mean, for the first time today, we hear by September. Well, where did that come from? Why don't they just come out with a basic plan like the US has done in Australia? I understand that we don't have a vaccine approved yet and that everything's contingent on that. But that shouldn't stop us from setting in place the plans that are necessary for this huge logistical exercise once it is done, as other countries have done. And I am very happy that we have Major General Fortin appointed. I think that's excellent. Why we're months and months behind the U.S., who did it, months and months ago, is a question I have. But I am confident that at least that he's there, and by all accounts is an extremely competent and well-respected leader. But we really have to get this federal Liberal government exhibiting some transparency. They've got to be leveling with Canadians. These are not state secrets. This is basic health information that Canadians and parliamentarians have a right to know. And there's no reason that they shouldn't be laying this out, unless the Liberals have done a poor job or they're behind the eight ball, which is what I suspect is the case.
Don Davies is the NDP health critic, and James Bezan is the Conservatives defense critic. Gentlemen, great to have you with us on this Friday. Appreciate your viewpoints.
Thanks, Todd. Have a good weekend.